What's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. Today we have a special guest with us. Dylan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Dylan. I'm with Fox. You probably see me running around the Rocky Mountain area a lot, doing a lot of events and such. Here with Twan to talk about some Fox shocks.
Obviously, in front of us today, we have all the Fox that you guys have probably seen on our website before. So on the far left here, we are going to talk about the 2.0s and then the 2.5s and then the brand new Elite series at the very end. So Dylan's going to go through each and one of these and kind of explain what they are kind of directed towards as far as the end consumer, and then we'll go through the rest. So first of all, we have the Fox 2.0. This is kind of like a leveling kit, right?
Basically like a leveling kit. It's a good upgrade with a shock, similar to what you'd see on like a Bilstein 5100, but kind of a next step up from that. Main reason being is it's an aluminum body construction. Aluminum will allow the shock to dissipate heat a little bit quicker. Okay. So you can kind of push the shock a little harder for faster compared to a steel body shock. Cool. That's one of the more unique things about the Fox stuff, is that most of it's aluminum or will be aluminum in the future.
Okay. Now, as far as height, I see a bunch of threads in here. So most of us with Toyotas want some kind of lift out of it. Yep. What's the max that you can get out of these?
So we recommend to stick around the 2-inch mark. You know, you could go a little bit higher if you wanted, but we recommend to stick that around the 2-inch mark, basically because we are a little more conservative on what we want for droop travel. You know, the higher you adjust it on a Toyota with the IFS, basically you're using up your droop travel for that. Gotcha. So we want the most droop travel possible, just basically for the best performance and ride. So we recommend around that 2-inch mark. If you have some weight on there, like if you put a front bumper on there, you can adjust a little higher to compensate for that.
Very cool. Paired with that, we have a 2.0 rear, if you can hold that. And then this one has a remote reservoir. So what's the difference between this one and this one?
Sure. So basically what a shock is doing is it's converting the motion of the suspension to heat inside the shock in the oil that's in there. Okay. And what we want to do is we want to keep that heat at a constant temperature, because the higher the heat, the thinner the oil is, and then the less damping control you get. Gotcha. So that's one reason why we do aluminum, is because aluminum can dissipate that heat a little bit more. Okay. More oil allows you to dissipate heat even more. So if we add a reservoir to that, that adds more oil to the whole system, means we can dissipate it. So you can run down that fire road, down that trail faster. Okay. And the shock won't fade out. Okay. So basically just more oil, more volume. Exactly. Okay. More consistent ride longer. Okay. One of the other things that we do in all of our shocks is we have an internal floating piston. So pretty much all shocks have oil inside. Okay. And then there's a spot where there's nitrogen as well, to keep the ride consistent, to prevent cavitation. Okay. That piston keeps it separated, that oil and gas separated. Okay. So with that, with the reservoir, the other thing too is we can move the internal floating piston into the reservoir, so we can actually gain some more travel too. Oh, okay. So the piston would be in here versus in here. Like this one, the piston's sitting in here. Gotcha. So that travel can only be up to like this point. Where if we move the piston over to here, we have the travel inside that shock the entire way. Gotcha. So you generally can get a little more travel with a remote res shock. Okay. And then that internal floating piston will keep that ride consistent. Okay. Well. It's kind of the name of the game, is consistency. Yeah. So remote reservoir is kind of the way to go, pretty much, if you want the top performance. And it's all about good, better, best scenario, right? You know, so like this is obviously a less cost, you know, the shock doesn't cost as much as that one does. Yeah. But depending on what you're doing with your truck, this may be more than enough. Yeah. So it really depends on kind of the line of how much you want to spend for how much performance you're getting. Okay. Next up, we have the coilover. So this is obviously bigger than the first one we showed you guys. So the body itself is a lot smaller. So this is a 2.0 and this one is a 2.5. So if you can explain a little bit why you would jump to this one over this one. Same thing, in the same kind of vein as the remote reservoir and larger diameter, the more fluid. The larger diameter shock gives you more fluid inside, so that you can dissipate that heat better. Okay. We also run a bigger piston in there because that diameter of the shock is now from 2-inch to 2.5, so that piston is bigger. Okay. Bigger piston means more surface area on it, means more damping control. Okay. So it's again a more consistent ride quality. Better control over different types of terrain, and then you can dissipate more heat. Okay.
So a little bit off topic, like the Baja race trucks. The reason why they run those big like 4.0s is because of that reason, right? The more
exactly.
volume.
More oil volume means more heat dissipation. You think about when you go to boil, water for pasta. A bigger pot is going to take longer to boil, so you can dissipate that heat.
Gotcha.
More. So the more oil volume you get, the more heat you can dissipate, the faster you can go for a longer period of time.
So those Baja racers, that's why they're able to go like 65 in the desert and it'll just absorb everything.
It absorbs it, and the main thing is they can do that for a long period of time. You could have a smaller shock.
Yeah.
And it would be able to do that for a short period of time, but what's going to happen is that oil is going to get so hot that the piston will just flow through the oil really quick.
And then it'll get really bouncy.
It's really bouncy.
Gotcha.
And you won't have a consistent ride after that. You'll lose your damping force.
Okay.
So with more oil volume becomes more control for a longer time.
Very cool. So this one does not have one of these blue and gold rings. Can you explain that to us?
Yep. So when the shock cycles, as the shock moves in and out, and you have the remote reservoir here, basically fluid is passing through this hose into the reservoir.
Okay.
What we can do is we can add more control to how the vehicle rides by metering the fluid that flows through here.
Okay.
And we can do that by adjusting the valve.
Okay.
So we can turn this compression damping control valve up, and that will make it firmer.
Okay.
So the reason why you'd want to do that, good example would be like for overlanding. The truck doesn't always weigh the same, right?
Yep.
Whether you have your gear in there, whether you may take it out when you drive it to work, or you may load it up for the weekend.
Okay.
More weight means you have to have more damping control.
Gotcha.
And we can adjust the damping control whether we have weight or whether we don't have weight.
Okay.
So that's another kind of the next step again. You can control the valving of the shock without having to tear it apart and revalve the shock.
So for those of you guys who don't know, this is called the DSC adjuster.
Yep.
So there's two rings. So this is probably one of my favorite things about Fox is that there is a low speed and a high speed adjuster.
Correct.
So you can control those independently, so you don't have to constantly just adjust the single knob that you can find on other shock brands.
Yep.
So the gold one, that's the low speed.
Correct. Yep.
So you could basically have low speed a little bit softer, and then the high speed a little bit stiffer, right?
Right.
Okay.
So I think in the last video you guys were talking about like progressive, linear, digressive valving.
Yep.
And what that is referring to is the speed of how quickly the shock is moving. And that's the same thing when we're talking about low speed and high speed compression.
Okay.
So when we're talking about speed of a shock, we're talking about how quickly this shock is cycling in and out.
Okay.
Not necessarily indicative of how fast the vehicle is driving down the road.
Okay.
But more about how quickly the suspension is cycling.
Gotcha.
So we have what's called high speed events and low speed events. A high speed event would be like driving down the road, you hit a pothole.
Yep.
And it cycles really quick.
So just a single time.
It's
quickly.
it's like a quick hit. That would be a high speed event.
Okay.
A low speed event would be like driving down the road and you make a corner and the vehicle leans to one side. That shock compresses slowly. So that would be a low speed event. It can, vehicle speed can affect that, but it's not quite the same thing.
Gotcha.
The way that's, one thing that's unique about Fox is that we have the ability to tune your high speed and low speed events independently of each other. Where, like you said, most companies of other brands will just be a single speed adjuster, a mid speed or something like that. So the nice thing about that is we can adjust how the vehicle feels on low speed events and how it feels on high speed events separately. An example of that would be, say you're driving down the highway and you go 80 miles an hour, you go make a turn. We can make it nice and firm for corners, but we can still make it soft for potholes.
Okay.
So by leaving the high speed low on how much we've adjusted it, but turning the low speed up, we can make it drive nice on the road, but then make it nice and soft when we hit bumps.
That's good to know, because the way I used to think about it, before you just told me that, is like, if I'm going fast, then I would want it stiffer. If I'm going slow, I want it softer. But now that you're explaining it, basically if you're going on a washboard, where it's cycling constantly, you would want that to be softer, right?
You would want it to be softer, but it really depends on how you're driving and what sort of events you're going to hit.
Yeah.
So for example, like down a washboard where the shock is cycling really quickly but really small amount, you kind of want that to be soft, right? Because you don't want it to be chattery and feel like you're going to bounce all over the road.
Gotcha.
But let's say we're driving down that same road and we see this huge dip and we hit it really hard.
Yeah.
We may want to have more high speed, because if it hits really hard and blows through the suspension travel, we want that the shock to slow us down before we hit bump stops.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you can kind of play with it and see what works best for your situation, for what your vehicle is, for your driving style, or the terrain you're on.
That's good to know. So this brings me to the point of, I guess, when you guys are deciding if you guys want something that is non-adjustable, non-DSC, or something that has the adjusters with low speed and high speed. So what would you recommend if you're just talking to a customer?
Sure.
This one versus that one, and why they would choose one over the other.
Yep. So the main thing that I always tell people why to go for a DSC is if you have a vehicle where the weight changes the most, that's where you're going to see the biggest benefit, because you can tune the DSC for the weight that you have in the vehicle at that time. So for example, if you're going camping, if you daily drive your truck, and then you also go, take it out on the weekends.
So basically a weekend warrior.
A weekend warrior.
Okay.
Is a perfect example of that, because the weight changes of it, whether you have your gear in there or you don't, is probably the biggest reason to get a DSC.
Gotcha.
The second biggest reason is if you wheel it a lot on different types of terrain.
Gotcha.
Like making the DSC very soft is great for rock crawling, because it's nice and soft, and it makes the shock move a lot.
Yeah.
But then if you start doing really fast stuff, then you want to be able to tune it to be a little firmer.
Okay.
So those are kind of the two main things, is if you change how you wheel or where you wheel a lot, and also if you change what the vehicle weighs, is going to be the biggest benefit to go for a DSC.
So that's kind of the main reason I chose to go with Fox DSC on our FJ Cruiser, just because we do daily drive it, and we like to go fast off-road, and we like to rock crawl as well. So for somebody, I guess, who doesn't do that but want great ride quality, a non-DSC or non-adjuster would work for them. But I guess every once in a while, if they go like maybe once every few months off-road, this would be okay?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, no matter what, any of these are going to work great. It's just more about the fact that you can kind of fine-tune your control for what you're doing even more so. Not to say, like, for example, that one won't work for rock crawling and then will be great for high-speed off-road. It all kind of is a compromise, right? The main thing with suspension is you want it to feel soft enough to be comfortable, but firm enough to control what you're doing.
Gotcha.
So it's all a bit of a compromise no matter what you're doing. And when you have a DSC or the ability to adjust the shock, you kind of reduce that compromise.
Gotcha. Okay, very cool. And that's one thing with Fox too. How long have Fox been in business? Like
Fox
40?
started in '74.
Okay, that's a long time.
Yep.
So another reason why to choose Fox is because they've been doing this for so long, and they kind of figured out the whole science behind all this stuff. Now, let's talk about the brand new, which is going to be right over here. So if you guys see this black and orange sticker on the shock bodies, this is their new Elite Series, and this is also a DSC, even though this adjuster is blue and gold. This one is going to have that black anodized and orange knobs on it. So if you guys see this, you guys knew this is their new Elite Series. So if you could talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so the main difference, this is basically our 2.5s, what we call the Factory Series, and this is the Elite Series. They're both, that one is a 2.5 DSC remote resi. This is a 2.5 DSC remote resi as well. This one's in a piggyback form, but it's basically the same thing. So biggest difference is that the body of this one is aluminum, body of this one is steel. Basically, as I said earlier, we're switching to aluminum for better heat dissipation, better corrosion resistance, and that's kind of the main reason. And now we're doing everything that's a Performance Elite is going to be a remote resi with a DSC. The DSC makes a big difference, and we kind of just said, you know what, everyone should have this if you're jumping up to this level of shock. It's just such a good system, so we're going to make it standard.
Okay, so very cool. Now, the other question, as far as weight, obviously aluminum's lighter.
Yep.
But strength, is it as strong? Did you go with a thicker material, or are we going to see issues with, you know, this is obviously steel, so it's stronger. Is there going to be issues with it being aluminum?
There's been some advances in basically the ability to machine and extrude these. So that's why originally most shocks were steel and historically have been steel.
Yeah.
So some advances in kind of techniques for machining and stuff have allowed us to get as strong of a shock with aluminum while being lighter.
So it comes down to the way and the material that you guys use. Okay.
And kind of the way it's extruded. So these are impact extruded, as these are too. And then there's different machining techniques that we're able to do to kind of make it as strong. Like I said, just kind of advancing technology as we go.
Okay.
That's probably one of the biggest things with Fox
is
that we have, you know, we tend to push the envelope as much as possible when it comes to R&D and technology.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff that we, you know, implement on race cars will then trickle down to the consumer market.
That's probably why you guys have won so many races.
Yep, exactly. There's a lot, we put a lot of emphasis on R&D for racing because we know that it's going to eventually trickle back down to the
That brings me
market.
to a point. Some of you guys who have been watching us for a while asked, why would you guys put a race branded shock on your daily driver? These are not made for race, right?
Right.
These are made for OEM fitment and OEM ride quality.
Yep.
So that myth of like, why would I put race shocks on my, you know, daily driver, is because you want that ride quality and that adjustability for when you guys go wheeling on the weekend or whatever. So definitely worth it, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And we love it. That's why we install so many of these, and we use this on our own vehicles and drive them daily. So
one other thing about Foxes, and a lot of other ones too, is that these are what we consider a lifetime shock. So there's seals, there's oil, there's valving inside. All of it's rebuildable.
Okay.
So you can take it apart, you can change the seals, you can change the oil. If, for example, with the DSC adjuster, you have like the low speed, it has 10 clicks of adjustment.
Okay.
The high speed has 12 clicks of adjustment.
Okay.
Let's say on a Tacoma, you have put on a bunch of weight, and now you feel like you're always having that DSC adjustment on the high end. It only rides good at 7 through 10.
Yeah.
And that that 1 through 6 is just way too soft. You can revalve the shock to then be a little bit firmer overall, and then you have your adjustment window
more
opens up.
adjustment. Okay.
Yeah, your adjustment window opens back up.
Okay.
Same thing with like the coilovers too. Foxes come typically, depending on the application, with like a 13-inch, 650-pound spring.
Okay.
They're valved for that, depending on the application.
Okay.
But for example, if you put more weight on the vehicle, you may need a heavier rate spring, or you might want a taller spring to get some more adjustment back out of it.
Okay.
You can absolutely do that.
So that brings me to a good point. So Fox obviously valves these for a stock weight Tacoma or 4Runner.
I would say close to it.
Okay.
We know that most people are adding weight. You modify a vehicle, you're going to add weight.
Okay.
So we don't want the people that just keep a stock vehicle to ride like a dump truck.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's known that it's going to usually increase the weight of the vehicle.
Okay.
So I would say more towards stock weight, but not necessarily that it's only good for stock weight.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, you guys have probably seen this before. There are companies that offer tunes for these shocks and other brand shocks. How do you, I guess, compare their tune versus the factory Fox tune? Because personally, I've always liked what Fox has done, and then with the DSG adjuster, adjust it from there. How do you feel that these companies are, I guess, tuning them?
Typically, they're tuning them for more weight, so they're making the base valve inside the shock firmer, because that's typically what happens. These are meant they're meant to work with factory weight. Again, like I said before, they're able to work with additional weight, but they're meant more towards that spectrum of factory weight.
Gotcha.
So most of the time, they're adding some more valving to it to control additional weight, because 90+% of the time, I have a Tacoma as well, and it is not factory weight.
Yeah.
So it ends up being heavier.
Okay. And we have this on one of our vehicles, and we have more weight, and it's just a factory Fox tune, not an aftermarket tune by any other brand, and it rides just fine. So really, do you think, I don't want to use the word gimmick as kind of the way that they're selling it. But do you think it's worth it to?
It does depend. Yeah, I mean, it does depend more on, you know, personal ride quality preference, because ride quality is a little bit subjective.
Yep.
And also it depends on the specific vehicle. You know, if say a Tacoma has 1,500 pounds in the back at all time, you probably want to have it revalved for a little more, you know, control.
Okay.
And it really does, like, say if you had a Tacoma and you had the factory tune on it and you just felt like, you know, the back was just marshmallowy, you know, like no matter what you did, especially if you had a DSC, no matter what you did, I would say, yeah, you want to revalve it for a little more control. But if you feel like it rides fine, like for example, you were saying it rides fine, there's no need then.
Gotcha. So I think personally, I would recommend just keeping it the way that Fox intended it to be, and then as you add weight or based on off your judgment, you can get it revalved or retuned however you'd like. Unless you already know you're going to be adding, let's say 1,500 pounds to it right off the bat, 2,000 pounds with a big like ALU cab or something like similar to that, then I would probably say get it tuned. But if you're like us, you just have a bed rack, a rooftop tent, bumpers, stuff like that, then I don't know if it's super necessary.
I would agree. So I always recommend to people to basically, if you're going to buy these, buy them, install them, see how they are. If you are going to buy them, install them, like you said, on a truck that already has an ALU cab on it or something like that.
Or if you're planning for it.
Or if you're planning for it, and probably would be a good idea. But if you're unsure of where your weight's going to be, buy it, install it, and then if you feel like you need to make a change, make a change. But don't generally start chasing a rabbit down a hole that may not even be there. So
because I see a lot of people that come in here with already tuned and their truck is basically stock. I'm just like, why did you do it like that?
We spent a lot of time, a lot of homework on tuning the shocks for that application specifically. So, you know, 90% of the time it's great out of the box, and you know there's outliers on either end that need a little bit, you know, fine tuning depending on how they want it to ride or what their vehicle is set up for.
And not to say that the tunes are bad. I just think that you guys should try this out of the box the way Fox designed it to be, and then from there, if you guys are adding a bunch of weight or going really fast or whatever, then get it tuned or revalved to work with your setup. So
typically too, you know, one thing we'll talk about is lifespan of the shocks. Everyone always asks me, how long do shocks last? It's kind of a loaded question because it depends on how you drive your vehicle.
How much you beat on it, I guess.
Exactly. And I like to connect it to the tires. So like I will say shocks will typically last as long as your tires last. If you are racing the Baja, tires are going to last about 1,000 miles. You know? So if you're, you know, driving around, you're doing some weekend warrior stuff, 50,000, 40,000, somewhere in that range, typically is about what we see. And again, it depends on where you are. If you're in Canada, road salt, that type of thing usually puts a little more wear and tear on the stuff. So that might be a little bit less. But you know, typically that 30 to 50,000 range is kind of what I recommend. Or if the shock starts leaking, then it's time to rebuild it. That said, when you do a rebuild, you can revalve it at the same time. You know, you're taking it all apart. Typically, a revalve doesn't usually cost much more to add into a rebuild. So,
so at that point,
if you're like, hey, I know that I'm adding, you know, more weight, or I have more weight, I do a rebuild and a revalve at the same time, and then you can kind of play with it at that point.
Gotcha. So that's pretty cool. And that's the great thing with going with a higher, more premium shock brand like Fox, is that later down the road, you're not going to have to be replacing it. You can just rebuild it and revalve it to the way your truck is, I guess, finished at that point. And one thing we didn't talk about was the coils. So if we could talk about that real quick. So if you guys look at this coil and how much thread is showing on the top here compared to this one here, if we could talk about that, that is called a preload, right? The preload.
Preload on the coil. So preload is basically how much the coil is compressed before it's has any weight on it. So right now the shock is at full extension. Yep. And the coil is compressed some amount, which is the preload on it.
Yep.
It looks like the preload on this is way less than the preload on this.
Yep.
But in reality, this is actually just a shorter spring. This is probably a 13-inch spring, and I bet you this is a 14-inch spring.
Yep.
So the preload may be similar, or maybe even less on this one, depending on kind of where it's set.
Gotcha.
So spring length can kind of factor into it. It may look like this one's cranked up way more, but in reality, it really isn't, or may not be.
So it might just be an inch difference of spring.
Overall spring length.
Yep.
And now the spring length can be different depending on the application, because one thing we want to make sure of is when the shock fully compresses, we don't get coil block, what we call. So like the coil basically turns into a solid block.
Yeah.
We don't want that to happen, because then this whole thing becomes basically your bump stop.
Yeah.
So depending on the application, which we may do a 13-inch spring or a 14-inch spring, or different wire diameter, because we don't want coil block to happen.
Gotcha.
So
generally when we do installs here, we are seeing Fox coming with a 13-inch spring. So we are needing to add more preload to the top, or it seems like we're adding more preload when you can see a lot of these threads showing. Another thing that customers are doing is that they will change it out to a 14-inch coil to reduce the amount of thread that is showing. Now, is there a benefit to a 13-inch versus a 14-inch coil?
Not really, other than you may get more adjustment range one versus the other. For example, on this one, if it's a 14-inch coil, you don't really have any room to go down. So if you were to install this on a truck and you got 2 inches of lift, you can't go down to 1 inch of lift.
That's true.
Where this one you could,
yes.
because you're able to bring it down.
Okay.
Now, depending, that may not matter to you, and you may have a heavy bumper and a winch, and you want more adjustment higher, so therefore this would be a benefit for you versus this one.
Gotcha.
So not really a benefit or a pro or a con either way.
Yeah.
The main thing we do want to watch out for is making sure that the coil doesn't coil block.
Yep.
And then a lot of people will say, like you said, it looks like there's more preload on it, but really there isn't, because the spring is just shorter.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you decide to rebuild, or when you decide to rebuild, the other thing is that a lot of this stuff is pretty modular, right? So you could swap out your springs at that point. You could revalve it. If you have this one that doesn't have an adjuster on it, you could swap out the reservoir for one with an adjuster.
Oh.
So being able to kind of upgrade as you go,
that's cool.
You can add stuff, you can add features to it later on down the road too.
Yeah. So when you guys are buying this, it is a couple $100 difference between the non-DSC and the DC. I think somewhere around $300, depending if you have a Tacoma or whatever. So later down the road, if you guys decide when you guys are rebuilding it, you want to add this, you guys can definitely do that. So very cool. I didn't know that.
Yep. Yeah, so you can definitely, a lot of the stuff is pretty modular. This shock here is basically the same thing. The reservoir is different, so you get a DSC reservoir and swap it out when you do the rebuild.
Yep.
And you're good to go.
Okay. All right. So one last thing we are going to talk about is that I know a lot of you guys are probably thinking about the new Elite Series versus the old, I guess, well, not old, but different, the DSC version. Now, they might look different. This is obviously not the same shock as this, but if they were the same, but this one was an Elite version, the tune inside versus the steel versus the aluminum. Now, is the tune the same? Or
be the same thing. The valving would be the same for the application.
Okay.
So this is not a Tacoma shock, but let's say this is a Tacoma shock, this is a Tacoma shock.
Yeah.
Say it's going to be the same for the application.
Okay. So the internals would probably be basically the same. The ride quality would be the same.
Yep.
It is just aluminum.
Versus steel. So you get better heat dissipation, corrosion resistance, all the benefits of the aluminum. And it's standard with the DSC now.
Gotcha.
So, and the DSC looks a little cooler in my opinion, with the orange.
Yeah,
but
I think.
But otherwise, functionality is the same.
Okay.
Same number of adjustments on this DSC versus that DSC.
Okay. So very cool. So all it really is just aluminum, and that's probably where Fox is going to be going. And yeah.
One thing to note: if any of you have DSC shocks, we wouldn't make the adjustments brightly colored and easily turnable if we didn't want you to play with them.
Gotcha.
So for you guys that have them and you haven't messed with them before, try it.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can hurt by turning them up and down.
Yeah.
What I generally tell people is turn them all the way to soft.
Yeah.
So all the way soft is basically turning them all the way left or loose, lefty-loosey is going to make it all the way soft.
Yeah.
drive it, a couple different terrains, turn it all the way firm.
Yep.
Drive it again. See what you like, see what you want to change,
Yeah.
And play with it. Like I said, there's nothing that you can hurt by turning the adjustments. So if you haven't done that before, give it a go.
Yeah, that's basically what I first did when I got these. I was just like, let's mess around with this. I was just turning it, basically what you did. You said so all the way soft and then all the way firm, and then putting in the middle and kind of fine tuning it where I like it, and then changing it as well again when you guys off-road. Yep. So.
Yep, and the easiest way to kind of know where it's adjusted is I will usually go all the way soft, and then it has little clicks or indents. So you count the clicks, and then you kind of figure out where you're at. So I'm like, all right, I'm turned in 4 on low speed and 3 on high speed, and then kind of play with it from there.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Dylan. We really appreciate you coming out today and kind of walking us through. I know there's a lot that I have questioned and you guys have probably questioned as well. So thanks a lot for explaining all of that.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. It's always nice having you around here. I'm glad you're in Colorado. So if you guys are in Colorado, be sure to hit us up here at Running for Tacos. If you see Dylan around at the expo shows or anything like that, make sure you should say hi to him. And I appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you guys in the next video.
Have a good one.
Later.